Look at this man, straight-backed, commanding, athletic, every inch a king at the absolute peak of his power. What if I told you he was 62 years old? Not the painting, not a metaphor. The man in this portrait, Louis XIV, the Sun King, was 62 when it was painted. He had no teeth. He walked with a limp. He was, by the standards of the day, genuinely old. You would never know it. And that was entirely the point. Because this isn't a painting. This is a weapon. A piece of propaganda so carefully engineered, so deliberately deceptive, that it would reshape how every monarch in Europe wanted to be seen. For the next 150 years. It's 1701, and the Sun King is not doing well. Decades of catastrophic wars have gutted the French treasury. His son and grandsons are dying around him. And his grandson, Philip V, has just inherited the Spanish throne, triggering a diplomatic crisis that will soon explode into one of the most destructive conflicts of the century. Louis needs to send Philip a gift, a statement, something that says, the man behind France's power is still strong, still untouchable, still the most feared ruler in the world. So he calls in Hyacinthe Rigaud. Rigaud isn't just a painter, he is the most sought-after portrait artist in Europe, the man who transforms a nobleman's insecurities into timeless grandeur. If you want to look powerful, you hire Rigaud. If you want to look immortal, you pay whatever he asks. Louis XIV wanted to look immortal. But here's the detail that almost nobody talks about. Louis never intended to keep this painting. The portrait was finished. It was spectacular. Louis looked at it and refused to let it go. He sent Philip a copy. He kept the original for Versailles. Think about that. This painting was so effective, so convincing, that the man who knew every single lie it contained still couldn't bear to part with it. So what exactly was Rigaud hiding? Start with the legs. At 62, Louis XIV's legs were ravaged by gout. He was physically diminished. But in the portrait, those legs are lean, muscular, and perfect. Historians believe Rigaud used a different model for the lower body, possibly a younger artist's apprentice, possibly a dancer. The king's face sits on top of a body that almost certainly never belonged to him. Is that art, or is that fraud? In 1701 Versailles, the line was wherever the king drew it. Then look at the pose. Rigaud places Louis in a contrapposto stance. One hip dropped, weight shifted, the natural posture of a man completely at ease with his own power. The ermine robe is thrown back almost casually, as if he tossed it aside mid-thought. His hand rests on the scepter of France, not like a man gripping his authority, but like a man who simply owns it. Every centimeter of this canvas is a calculated decision. Nothing is accidental. Let's read this painting the way Rigaud intended it to be read. The fleur-de-lis, it's everywhere. On the robe, on the upholstery, woven into the background. This isn't decoration. It's a reminder that Louis XIV doesn't just rule France. He is France. The nation's symbols are literally wrapped around his body. The column in the background, classical architecture, deliberately Roman. It ties Louis to the Caesars, to Augustus. It says, this man doesn't belong to a century. He belongs to history itself. The crown and scepter aren't being worn or carried. They're placed nearby, almost casually, because a king who needs to display his crown is still proving himself. A king who sets it aside has already won. And then, the shoes. Look at the shoes. High-heeled, red-soled, decorated with miniature battle scenes. Louis XIV was reportedly 5 feet 4 inches tall. He wore heels his entire reign. Rigaud painted those heels, but positioned them so they read as a fashion statement, not a height correction. Even the footwear is propaganda. Here's something that complicates the legend of this masterpiece even further. Hyacinthe Rigaud ran what you might today call a production studio. He had a workshop, a team of specialists, and inside that workshop, there was a division of labor that would shock anyone who romanticizes this as a singular artistic vision. Rigaud painted the face, sometimes the hands, the robes, assistants, the architectural background, assistants, the elaborate drapery, the symbols, the decorative flourishes, all farmed out to specialists who did nothing else. This was completely standard for the era. It wasn't considered dishonest. But think about what it means. The most authentic element of this portrait, the king's actual face, was painted by one man. Every single symbol of power surrounding it was painted by others. A painting designed to project the absolute unity of the French monarchy was itself a collaboration that Louis XIV never fully knew about. The portrait went up at Versailles, and then something remarkable happened. It spread. Within decades, every royal court in Europe was commissioning portraits in the same language. The classical column, the casually draped robe, the easy relationship with power, the pose that says, "I didn't fight to become king, I simply am." But the most striking copy came a full century later. In 1805, Napoleon Bonaparte commissioned Jacques-Louis David to paint his imperial portrait. Put the two images side by side, Rigaud's Louis XIV and David's Napoleon, and the composition is almost identical. The stance, the robe, the scepter, even the precise distance from the throne. Napoleon wasn't being lazy, he was making a statement. He was deliberately quoting Louis XIV, saying, "I am the continuation. I am the new Sun King." One painting, one carefully engineered set of lies. And it defined the visual grammar of European power for 150 years. So here's the question. This painting is really asking, when we look at an official image of a king, a president, a CEO on a magazine cover, how much of what we see is actually real? Louis XIV understood something we're still learning in the age of Instagram filters and political image consultants. Power isn't just what you have, it's what you project. Rigaud gave him the perfect projection: young legs on an old body, Roman permanence in a French court, absolute confidence, manufactured in an artist's workshop by men the king never thanked. And Louis XIV, the man who knew every lie in that canvas, looked at the finished work and thought, "This is how I want to be remembered." He was right. 300 years later, we're still talking about it. The portrait of Louis XIV by Hyacinthe Rigaud isn't just the most famous royal portrait ever painted. It's a blueprint for how power has been packaged and sold to the public, long before photography, long before television, long before social media. Every image of authority you've ever seen owes something to this canvas. If you want more of the hidden stories behind history's most famous moments, subscribe. There's a lot more where this came from. And drop a comment. What other official portraits do you think are hiding something? I read every one.